All right, so thank you to Caroline and to the State Library for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with you today. So as was mentioned, brand new to South Carolina. This is probably my third full week in the position as chair. So, but I've been doing this work for a long time. Have given a lot of talks in this area. And so if you've ever heard me speak or seen a video or something, you know that I don't pull any punches. So I hope that we will be able to have a really honest and brave conversation about equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. So I work with adults, although I have been academic librarian before becoming faculty, but I consider my job to be working with the professionals who work with our communities. And in order to do this work and to do this work well, because this work can be difficult, there is a lot of work that we need to do within ourselves, a lot of reflection, a lot of contemplation about what EDI looks like in our settings and how can we best facilitate this work for our communities. So as I mentioned, currently faculty, but I always like to let librarians know that I have a little street cred. I have been a practicing librarian. I still consider myself to be a librarian. I have written a couple books, as you heard Caroline say, and 2 books specifically about diversity and social justice. So I am really working with other LIS program faculty and certainly practicing librarians and library professionals to incorporate this work into their practice and into their environments. So I told you a little bit about why we're here today, or at least I told you why I'm here today. And you know, the title of the talk is called Edifying Your Practice, but really I want to talk a little bit about decolonizing our practice, and I'll get into that in just a second. But again, wanting to talk and have brave conversations so you can do this work to the best of your ability. So we start out with this idea of decolonizing our practice and our profession by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of South Carolina. And so we need to be completely aware of where we are, where we stand, who came before us, and we need to realize that the practice that we have, the profession that we have, the society that we have doesn't always recognize who came before. So I wanted to start out with that. And I know that you'll hear from Kathleen Hayes later on today in this realm, so I think it's important to start today with this as well. So you see the picture here on the screen. It says decolonize your syllabus. And I have a citation here from where this idea kind of reemerged maybe about a year ago. So Dr. Chavez is an academic, and she was talking about when we are in academia, when we are in classrooms, how are we communicating with our students, right? And so in our case, how are we communicating with our patrons, et cetera? And really this idea of decolonizing your syllabus, and for today we're thinking about decolonizing our libraries, our collections, our practices, our services, right? So just think of all of this interchangeably. Really this idea of we have a canon in literature. We have a canon in librarianship. We have a canon in every discipline. And typically these canons favor white men, Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied, and it's not really incorporating all of the diverse voices that make up the communities and the society that we live in. So when you think about decolonizing your syllabus, your libraries, your profession, etc., who are those diverse voices that you should be bringing into your libraries, in your collections? Who are the diverse populations that you're serving through your programming? Through your services and everything that you're doing in the library. So this idea that we are socialized with white heteronormative ideals, it really gets to this idea that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? So if we're not constantly being vigilant and saying, no, we need to diversify this collection. No, we need to have some speakers that look like the community members that are coming to this program. This is what we're going to talk about in terms of decolonizing our profession and our services. So specifically what I do research on, and this is usually what my teaching revolves around, is this idea of decolonizing our practice, our services, our profession, and these are some of the elements that I think are included in this process. And so I teach a class in actually 3 of these, so this is just the tip of the iceberg. I can talk to you all later. Librarian at heart, I can give you readings for days, but I will talk about a few of these. And this is what I mentioned earlier about the self-work that's involved, right? So critical self-reflection. Who are we? We all have identities. We all have multiple identities. We may have identities that we are particularly proud of. We may have identities that we are actually afraid to share with others. And then we have identities, for example, skin color. I couldn't hide it if I wanted to, right? And so we need to understand who we are as very complex people in order to understand who our patrons are and who our students are and what they're going through. Empathy, this idea that we want to understand who people are and what they're going through, right? I think sometimes, libraries are very busy. Sometimes our work can become very transactional, and we need to kind of pull back sometimes and realize that we're actually dealing with people. And they're coming in with their own baggage and their own complications. And, sometimes we may think that we have a difficult patron or we're having a difficult day. That may be so, but we are also dealing with humans, and we would want someone to deal with us with compassion and empathy because we all deal with the water company. We all deal with the folks at Publix, right? And we want people to interact with us as human beings that deserve compassion and consideration. Cultural competence and humility, I will come back to that in just a moment. Racial literacy, that's a whole other day-long workshop. Okay, but I will mention it. And then the last 3, culturally responsive pedagogy, feminist pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy. All right, so once you have done this critical self-reflection in this type of internal work, these are tools that we have. A lot of them come from the education realm. And this can help us do our work in libraries. And so when I give these talks, I know sometimes librarians say, I'm not a teacher, I'm not an educator. Oh, but you are, right? And so we need to be thinking about our pedagogy as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about pedagogy as I move through, but just wanted to make a note of these specific types of pedagogy that can help us do our work in libraries. So cultural competence is an ongoing process. And before I get into this, I just want to point out some of the things in your handout. So like I said, librarian, I'm always going to come with papers and citations. So you have the Edifying Our LIS practice. This is a link with a list of all of the citations and things that are mentioned in this specific talk. So you have those for your later reference. There is an article called Considering Cultural Competence, and this I wrote this with a colleague, Dr. Renee Hill at the University of Maryland. So if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into cultural competence, these are some of the top books, articles, and resources that we think will get people up and running in this area. We have another article that has y'all's cover, Young Adult Library Services. So this is the magazine from the YALSA, the Young Adult Library Services Association out of ALA. And in this latest issue, which just came out earlier this month, I have an article entitled White Kids Need Diverse Books Too. So I know I've already met a couple folks in collections, but this is really getting more into this idea that we need to move beyond the transaction. We can't just have diverse books in the collection because it's the thing to do, or because if we don't do it, we know the other library is doing it and we have to keep up with the Joneses and things of that nature. So are you adding diverse books to your collection for the right reasons? Have those books in your collection? Are you putting them out in an effective manner so people actually learn from them and use them, right? This is not just about a circulation count. We have a handout, best practices for diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence for faculty. And this was specifically a handout that I received from Dr. Michelle Bryan, also at the University of South Carolina, specifically about racial literacy. All right, so again, she's focused on a classroom setting, but is 200% applicable to our environments in libraries. And then lastly, we have things I never learned in library school because you didn't take my class. Decolonizing our public libraries, okay? So this is just because, you know, I like people to have resources because that's what I like, but also just because we have a limited amount of time and I want to send you home with tools. All right, so let's get back to the presentation itself. So cultural competence, I've written an entire book about it. I teach an entire 16-week class in this area. But just to say, this cultural competence, how are we becoming more than aware of the differences of the people that we work with, the people that we serve? Right? And this goes beyond people who look different from us, but, you know, have different religions, different abilities, and on and on and on. How do we get to the point where we are aware of the differences, but also celebrate the differences and look forward to using those differences to create a better environment and community, right? So this is about really becoming as inclusive as possible. So when we talk about cultural competence, it does have, you know, a couple of tenets. This is by no means a comprehensive list, one of which is intersectionality. I'm sure you've all heard the word, and it's, you know, become rather trendy. But really what it gets down to is this idea of, again, we all have multiple dimensions of our personality, of our identity, what makes us what we are. And with that identity, some identities privilege us and some identities disadvantage us. So intersectionality is really talking about those interlocking oppressions of things that, you know, sometimes our identity works against us, right? And we have to kind of overcome additional circumstances. And so I'll come back to this. We have like a very brief exercise to talk a little bit about intersectionality. I've already mentioned empathy to you. Privilege and oppression. Right? This idea that we all have privileges, we all have oppressions. And I'll have a specific example of that coming up for you as well. Cultural and intellectual humility. So just by showing up today, you all have cultural humility, right? So when we were going around introducing ourselves and people were saying, I just want to learn more, I want to do more things in our libraries, that is cultural and intellectual humility. This idea that you know that you don't know everything, right? That there's always something for you to learn. There's always a way for us to improve. That is cultural and intellectual humility. And then just, you know, the ongoing theme, the lack of diversity in our profession at large, right? And again, that's a whole other talk about how we don't have enough diverse populations in our ranks. Right? And that's actually how I met Shannon doing this work with recruitment and really trying to bring more diverse voices to the profession. And it's not only about recruiting, it's about retaining. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this idea of intersectionality and the multiple parts of our identity. So this is a very, very simplistic way to point out that people are complex, that people are intersectional, that people have multiple identities. So if you were to put the patron, and this could be your children, this could be your young adults, your seniors, whoever you are serving in your libraries, just the things that make up people's identity, and there could be 10 more. Right? We have sexual orientation, we have SES, which is socioeconomic status, right? So we've got a lot of people living below the poverty line. We have a lot of folks that are food insecure, et cetera. So that would fall, you know, into that category. We have different gender identities, right? There's lots of conversation about, you know, how to serve trans patrons. The bottom line is you treat them like a patron, right? But lots of conversation about that. We have folks with different religions. We have obviously different races and ethnicities, and we have different education levels. Okay, so again, this idea that when someone comes up to you, my favorite example is you could have an African-American male veteran who is homeless, who is an amputee, and who is suffering from mental illness. Very intersectional person. So because of the way we're socialized, maybe what you see when he first comes in is you see a black man. That's cool. But maybe today he's coming into the library because he wants a vegan cookbook, right? So this idea that we make assumptions, right, is that transactional, is that very, oh, I know who this is. Not really, right? So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you just to take 2 minutes. And this is also in the handout. It has a series of bubbles. And really, all I want you to do is just think about your identities. And you don't have to, dig too deep. You'll have this to take home and consider later. But just thinking about who are you? What are the different identities that make up who you are? So I always do the exercises that I ask my students and my audience members to do. Okay. And so again, this is not the extent of my identity, but just for, to get some talking points going. Heterosexual, middle class, female, identified, Christian, African American, and education level, I have a PhD. All right, so intersectional, right? And some of these identities afford me a great amount of privilege, others not so much, right? So when I do this exercise, particularly in class, I point out to the students, who all call me Dr. Cooke, I have great privilege on this campus, sometimes, because of this degree, right? So that gives me particular privilege on the campus. It gives me entry into places that I didn't have entry to before, okay? Point of privilege. However, when I leave the campus and I get on 277, I'm another black female who's afraid to get pulled over by the police, right? I can't take off my skin tone, my racial ethnic identity, etc., right? So in lots of areas that gives me great privilege. When I'm driving, I feel like it might be a little bit of a disadvantage, right? So, these are the things, that we need to point out and that we need to understand also about the populations that we serve. They all have privileges and advantages as well. Now, what I would challenge you to think about, does your library, and think about your services, your collections, your staff, et cetera, are you creating a space of privilege or disadvantage for your patrons? I heard, right? But if you have people who feel uncomfortable or unwelcome, or when I used to work at academic library desk, we all had what we referred to as groupies. And I mean that with love, I'm not picking on them. But there were people who would wait for me to come on the desk. There were people who would wait for others of my colleagues to come on the desk because that's who they felt comfortable with. That's who they knew was going to help them. I am the one who looks like them. Okay, so what privileges and disadvantages are coming out in your library? All right, so in a nutshell, and again, there are many other things that we could add to this list. A culturally competent librarian in library will value diversity, will have mechanisms in place to assess their level of cultural competence. All right, because cultural competence is not something that's one and done. You can't check the box and say, hey, I'm culturally competent. This is going to be an ongoing process, it's an iterative process. As you change, as your communities change, your levels of cultural competence could vary, right? They could fluctuate. And so you have to do the work to keep them at the level that's effective for you and your system. Now, hopefully, a culturally competent library will be headed by leaders and instructors who are conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact. So when I teach these diversity and social justice related courses, I have to make sure I tell students, you could be as culturally competent as you want, and be fabulous and doing wonderful things. And it is always possible that you could work for an institution or an organization that is not culturally competent. All right, so this is not a given that just because you're culturally competent, everyone around you is going to be culturally competent. So I heard today that there are folks on different committees, that there are libraries and things of that nature. You all are doing hard work, right? Because if you happen to be in a place where the non-committee members are not interested in what you have to say and say, oh, she's being sensitive again. Oh, here she goes again, right? Then you know, you've got a little bit of an uphill battle there, right? So it's hard work. I freely acknowledge that. I actually left the library after 9 years because I couldn't make a dent, right? So I don't say this to say, you know, to burn yourselves out, although it does happen, or to continually knock your own heads against the wall, right? Organizational cultures are tough, right? And they are real, all right? So number 4 on the list, be committed to the continuous acquisition of cultural knowledge. And by this, coming to workshops such as the one today, reading articles, reading books, watching documentaries, whatever works for you. There are lots of excellent podcasts now on race and ethnicity and diversity, et cetera. And I say this to say, and again, take this with love, you can't continually ask the people who are marginalized to educate you. Right, so part of this self-reflection and internal work that you do is you learning on your own. Right, you're all library professionals. I know you can search with the best of them. Okay. And the 5th way, develop ways to adapt and embrace diversity and promote equity and inclusion. Okay, you've all heard that saying, if you see something, say something. Has lots of different applications, but in this case, if you have a particular expertise, be loud about it. Be bold about it, right? Everyone's not going to like what you say. Doesn't matter, right? All right, so now that I've talked a little bit about cultural competence and intersectionality, I just want to point out in this citation, librarians as active bystanders, that's on your list. Just to talk about the different ways that we can make a difference as folks who are doing this EDI and justice work. So there are various levels, and we are borrowing this from sociology, talking about how people interact in greater society. We can make a difference on a micro level, okay? So the micro level could actually be the internal work that we do. How am I making changes on a micro level? And I don't want you to think that micro is minimal, right? It just means, you know, the proximity. Right, so this is your self-work that you're doing. Once you do some of that micro work, then you can do what's called meso work. Meso meaning middle. All right, so that could be, what work are you doing in your libraries? You know, what changes can you make? What actions can you take? That would be meso. Macro. This is what can you do on a societal level? Right? And this wouldn't necessarily have to be within your library. This could be your volunteer work. This could be your place of worship. This could be whatever you're doing in the community. Now, certainly it could be tied to your library, right? But macro meaning society. All right, so again, on the micro level, this is when we were talking about engaging with cultural humility, the critical self-reflection, you know, thinking about some of your identities and how you bring your identities to your workplace. All right, I went to a workshop last week, and it was the racial literacy workshop, and the presenter said, how do you bring yourselves to your classroom? And there was a gentleman behind me, long time classroom teacher, and he said, I don't. He said, I only concentrate on the learning and the books and the information that I have to give to the students. So I was sitting in front of him, so he didn't see me roll my eyes at him. But I was like, oh, it's gonna be a long 90 minutes. Because we can't help but not bring ourselves to wherever we go and whatever we're doing. Okay, so that micro work, how are we bringing ourselves to the library or to our organizations? Again, meso, how are you engaging with the community? How are you co-producing knowledge? right? Do you go in there and say, these are the books that we're going to give you, and these are the programs we're going to offer because we're the professionals and we know best? Or are you engaging with your community and asking them what they want and what they need, right? No one is going to be a better expert in what they want but them, okay? Macro level, working for the community, in the community, and working against systemic inequities. All right, so you could have these bang-up services for people experiencing homelessness. Is there anything the library can do to address the root causes of the homelessness? Because when people experiencing homelessness come to your library, you're interacting with a symptom of a larger issue. So if you're working on a macro level, what can you do to address those systemic or underlying causes? Okay, so now this is all very fluid, right? You know, next week you might do some micro work. The following week you might do some macro work, right? So these are all kind of, you know, blurred lines. Nothing is black and white, no pun intended, with these categories. Okay. So, ending this section with a quote by Audre Lorde, legendary poet, activist. She was also a librarian. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Now, I will just let you know that I have actually had people push back on this, and I'm like, who back on Audre Lorde? But we have some folks that feel like if I disagree with someone's lifestyle choices, and that's usually how I get the phrase, I don't want to celebrate that because they're wrong. We've got a lot of literal folks, right? And so then my response to that is, okay, don't celebrate it, but you absolutely need to respect it, right? If you're expecting people to respect you and your identity and your lifestyle, then you need to respect yours as well. All right, so let me give you a couple of examples, right? So as I am encouraging you to engage with intellectual and cultural humility, I do the same, particularly when I am in a setting where I often speak and definitely often teach in classrooms where I might be the only visible minority. Right, so I am coming from the University of Illinois, great institution, not the most diverse place in the world. So I was teaching in a place where lots of students had never seen a teacher that did not look like them. Had not gone to school from all K to 12 with people who did not look like them. Okay, so now for the most part, that wasn't an issue. But I did have a few people who felt like, well, no, I can't learn anything from you. And we're hostile enough to kind of make that an issue in the classroom, right? So I don't go into the classroom making any assumptions about, you know, what people are thinking, what their experience is. And, you know, even though my classes literally have race, gender, sexuality, social justice, all in the title, I will still have people come take the class because it's trendy and marketable, and expect me not to push them, and expect not to learn anything, okay? Not the for you. All right, so with that said, I'm usually in a constant loop of trying to figure out, okay, well, that didn't go well, and how do I make this better, right? The most recent loop that I've been in, and I write about all of these loops, if anyone's interested, is how do I make that connection essentially between theory and practice. But how do I make that connection between, for students, I should say, for my patrons, etc. How do I make that connection between what you know to be cultural competence, and how do you enact it, right? Because it's not an automatic process. So let me tell you the example, and I think it'll make more sense. So I was teaching instruction class, library instruction. So if you're doing information literacy sessions, you should all take my class. So I had a great guest speaker, African-American woman who was teaching in a community college with a predominantly African-American student body. And she was teaching at night. And so she would get folks that were coming into the library for instruction after a full day of work, they've put babies to bed, they've made dinner, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing they want to do is come into the library and hear her talk about Shakespeare and EBSCO and these things. So because she had taken my class, she knew that what she should be thinking about is, how do I make a connection with these people, right? Not how do I conduct this transaction with the patron, but how am I interacting with these human beings who are coming into my space? And so she decided that she was going to use hip hop as an example. And so and I can't remember because some of these rappers I don't know because it's a little beyond my time, but say she would say, you know, I'll use what I know. Biggie and Tupac had a beef. So that's the example. So she would use, you know, those examples to go into the databases and pull information. And so, you know, not really relevant to what they were doing in class, but maybe she made them laugh, and maybe she made enough of an impression so that when they did have to do the actual term paper, they would say, hey, can I come back and talk to you? Right? That's really just the goal, especially of these one-shot sessions. So we're talking about all of this, and she and I are the only visible minorities in the room. And so after the guest speaker, I say, okay, who has questions? Crickets. Again, who has questions? So at this point, I could see that there were a couple folks that were like visibly uncomfortable, which I didn't know what was happening. Finally, a student raises her hand and says, well, I don't think that's professional at all. Now, let's talk about the dog whistling and the coded language and the inherent implications and stereotypes that come with telling an African American woman that hip hop is unprofessional and she shouldn't be using it in the classroom. So think back to what I said to you when I began the talk about decolonizing, right? So this librarian is not teaching the canon. So therefore, it's unprofessional. And what are the implications of saying to this black woman that this huge cultural phenomenon, which is rap music, is unprofessional? So there's a lot going on there. So needless to say, I was unhappy and could not figure out, I literally jaw dropped. My guest speaker stepped in and she said, it is always professional when you respect the cultures of the people that you are talking to. Done. I didn't have to do anything else. But you know, to say that this took me on maybe a 2-3 semester journey of, we had just gone over cultural competence. We had just gone over these slides plus many more, the steps. We had done the readings, we had read examples. And I had one student that said to me, I am a feminist pedagogy scholar. So if you're a feminist pedagogy scholar, this should never have crossed your mind. So what that said to me is that there's a disconnect. You know, I can check the box, I can take the class, I can write the paper. But when it comes down to when they're in Richland, when they're in Spartanburg, when they're in any of these libraries, are you actually living and enacting what it is you say that you espouse? All right, so that's that disconnect. So now as an instructor, I can't always, or I should rephrase that, I can't make someone believe something, right? All I can do is give them information and really give them some personal stories, right? And try and engage in that empathy and that intellectual humility with the students to hopefully get them to understand why some of these things are important. So with this particular loop, it really kind of inspired for me this content reboot, where I had to decide and figure out a way to interact more personally with my students as human beings. Right? And again, not that transaction between, I have 16 weeks to get you from A to B and write this paper, right? So there's transactional thinking in every discipline, right? In every space. And how do I step back and just have more stories and more conversation while weaving in the content that is necessary, all right? And then that's what you all do as practicing LIS professionals. How do you bring your voice and other important voices to the services, to the collections, to your one-on-one interactions with your diverse populations? So with that said, I encourage people to become new storytellers. Now really briefly, who I have on the screen here, this is my friend Melanie Townsend Diggs. And Melanie used to work for the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. And when the uprising in Baltimore happened after the death of Freddie Gray, it was her branch that was directly across the street from everything that was literally burning. And so Melanie got a lot of press, deservedly so, for bringing people into the library to literally keep them safe. So she brought a lot of people in, and at some point they had to lock the doors. And so if you listen to her talk about her experience, if you listen to Scotty Bonner, who works in Ferguson, Missouri, who's got similar acclaim, if you listen to them talk, they'll both tell you, I was doing my job. You know, my job is to take care of my community. My job is to make sure that they're safe and then provide them the information that they need. My job is to make them feel welcome. So I agree 200% with that. But why is it that the news and people who are not familiar with libraries were saying, oh my God, this is incredible, we didn't know libraries did this? If they don't know, we need to do better, right? We know, this was not a surprise to us, right? So we need to be better advocates for ourselves, okay? Similarly, this is Shara Kowalski, who works at the Philadelphia Free Library. And Shara was named a mover and shaker, has given TED Talks, all of these wonderful things, because she was administering Narcan to her patrons. Now, as a side note, she told me this and I was just dumbfounded. Philadelphia is a destination for heroin. Evidently, the heroin is that good that people travel to Philadelphia for drugs. So her library, where she was working, was off of a park. So people were literally overdosing in the park and in her bathroom. So, you know, when I mentioned burnout earlier, she's now in an administrative position, which I'm like, you do you, because she was going through a very intense multi-year period doing this work. But again, this is part of the work that we do that perhaps people don't know. You know, and then I have, you know, students, you know, that get out into the world and say, you didn't teach me about this. Now listen, I can't teach you how to actually administer the Narcan, right? But I can tell you that this could be part of what you're doing. And you could be in a rural library. This is just not an urban problem, right? And breaking down some of those stereotypes, because I've had students say to me, I don't want to work in a city because I don't want to work with those people, right? The farmers overdose too. Like, that's all I have for you, okay? New storytellers, teaching and interacting with people post-Charlottesville. We are in a very particular time right now where racism is rampant. Okay, got it. Racism is rampant, and we have to have conversations that we've never had to have before. So I'm particularly looking forward to hearing what Richland is doing about having some of these really hard conversations and facilitating dialogue, because that's a skill we need to be up with as well, right? So I want to start winding down, I should say, with this idea of transformative information services. And this is an article from 1999 written by Dr. Clara Chu, longtime diversity educator, LIS educator. And her words are just as applicable in 2019 as they were in '99 when she wrote them. She said that transformative information services recognizes that information transforms one's reality and pushes one towards action for oneself. It applies to librarians because the model assists them to understand the social reality in which they work and to consider information services as a tool for users in the process of self-empowerment and self-learning. It applies to users because it identifies the transformative power of information. All right, so we're wrapping up all of the cultural competence, the racial literacy, the intellectual humility, and thinking about how we use that to convey the information. We are information providers, but we are information providers within a context. Okay. So just to end with a couple of things, if we circle back to this idea of decolonizing, Someone said on Twitter, if you're going to decolonize the university, and in this case, think about the library, the profession, you address the structures and the policies and the practices that minoritize those locked out of those spaces and those trapped within them. All right, so again, this is not just putting up a diverse book display. If the infrastructure is still, for lack of a better word, is still rotten, that book display is not going to change the underlying causes of the problems you're experiencing. If you want to think about diversifying your collection and displays, and this is actually on the handout as well. Again, an incomplete list, but it does link to a longer article if you want to read more. Are you communicating the author's background, or are you just putting the books up? Are you having displays outside of Black History Month about Black people? All right, and this could go for any marginalized group. Is this part of your practice? Just doing a public service announcement in the given month. Using full names will likely convey the author's gender and possibly their racial background, include photos, include profiles and web pages, right? So this is part of our passive programming, right? If you want to learn more about this important new voice, this is, more information for you. Diversifying the profession. We have to spend more time talking honestly and explicitly about some of these problems, right? We can't say, nope, that's not my, nope, that makes me uncomfortable. Nope, I don't want to talk about this again. I already checked my box for the year. Like we have to stop this, okay? And some of the challenges are acknowledging our roles as gatekeepers. We are gatekeepers of the canon, right? Whether we want to admit that or not. Having the time to spend, right? So again, while I'm encouraging us not to think of things as transactional, we do have a business and an organization to run. So that means certain things have to be done, right? And really feeling competent enough to discuss the topics. And I hope that, when you leave here today, you'll feel more empowered to have some of these conversations if you're not already having them. Last quick example, maybe some of you have heard about the Read Woke Challenge, and this is particularly for children and young adults. And there have been various challenges in this area. You're encouraging your children, your young adults, to read things in books that reflect different realities, different cultures, etc. So I am 99.9% happy with this. What I'm not happy with is this idea that part of this challenge is to give voice to the voiceless. You are not giving them anything. What we should be doing is acknowledging or amplifying these voices, right? So I wish I had more time to talk about language. I could talk to you about that for another hour. What is the language that we're using, right? So when we continue to use this deficit language, it reinforces that socialization. We don't have time to walk through it. I can walk through it with you later during the breaks. What voices are missing from your libraries? Do your collections, services, and programs represent a single story or population, or do they present diverse perspectives and diverse information needs? Lastly, you've heard of the Bechdel test. This is for movies and things. Does the movie have at least 2 significant female leads? There's now the Gray test. Does your article cite at least 2 women of color? Right? So what are these things that you can be adding to your programs and to your collections to make sure that it passes some of these tests? All right, see, these are some of the small but active things that we can do in this idea of decolonizing our practice. This is a video that I can't show you, but this was at last year's Golden Globes, and it was the Green Book, the movie. And it was just, movie has other problems, that's another workshop. They panned across this stage of white men, and then there was Octavia Spencer and I think another, maybe Mahershala Ali, who starred in the movie. And they're standing there and they're excluded. They're not part of the celebration. They're just kind of there for window dressing. They're tokens. All right, so one of my students posted this and said this was me in library school. All right, so I had to go lay down and think about, what we were doing about this, right? But again, library school reflects the profession. All right, so thinking about our diverse folks in our ranks that may eventually leave because they're always on the sidelines. Decolonizing the profession. All right, so I end with, and I'm just going to scroll through this, think about how do you want to be remembered? Are you helping or are you hurting? Are you empathetic? Are you culturally competent? Are you working to decolonize the profession in your organization, or are you just maintaining the transactional status quo? All right, so with this critical self-reflection, think about your own legacy as a library professional, because we do make a difference. Okay? This is it, I swear. If you want to learn about a culture, listen to the stories. If you want to change a culture, change the stories. So thank you for your time. I look forward to talking with you throughout the day.